And then one of your friends moves away, and you find some new friend, and you invite them to go do the same activities. You can't say to your new friend, oh, by the way, my old friend promised to pay for the food and drinks this time, so now you have to pay. No. Today, we're talking about Chapter 4 of The Concept of Law by HLA Hart. The name of this chapter is Sovereign and Subject. This is the second of the two chapters, chapters 3 and 4, where Hart is attacking Austin's theory of law. Right, so remember Austin's theory from earlier. Austin's theory was a kind of behaviorist theory of law. It was a theory that explained all of legal events entirely in terms of orders or commands given by a sovereign, and a sovereign was just someone who is defined by Austin. This is how Austin understood the notion of sovereignty in terms of habits of behavior, patterns of behavior, specifically habits of obedience. You may remember that a sovereign for Austin, right, was just defined as someone who meets two conditions. One is that they are habitually obeyed by everyone within a certain territory, habitually obeyed by others, and that they themselves don't habitually obey. They don't themselves habitually obey anyone within that territory or outside of that territory. That's what it takes for someone to be a sovereign. And so sovereignty is understood entirely in terms of patterns or habits of behavior, of obedience. Hart is going to be claiming in this chapter that the notion of a habit is just not a powerful enough explanatory resource to explain some of the complexities that we find in real life, full-blown legal systems. You got to remember that when you're explaining some interesting, somewhat mysterious phenomenon like law, it's always better to use poorer explanatory resources. It's more impressive if you can explain this big complicated thing like law just in terms of patterns of behavior, right? That's a very simple, explanatory resource that you're appealing to. If you can use just that, then you've done something more interesting, right? And better. However, Hart is going to be claiming that won't work in this case. Habits or patterns of obedience are never going to be enough to explain what's going on in legal systems. Okay, so what's going on? Well, here's what Hart says very close to the beginning. I think it's in the third paragraph of chapter 4. Okay, so this is Hart at the beginning of the chapter telling you what the plan for the chapter is, or at least part of the plan, at least for the part of the chapter that we read for this course. He says, we shall inquire whether such a habit, that is, the kinds of habits that are involved in Austin's definition of the sovereign, we shall inquire whether such a habit is sufficient to account for two salient features of most legal systems. Can these facts about legal systems, can these features or characteristics of legal systems be explained by just habits? One, the continuity of the authority to make law possessed by a succession of different legislators. That is, the fact that the authority or normative power to make law continues uninterrupted. That's what continuity means. It keeps going without interruption, right? The fact that that authority keeps going from one legislator to another. And two, this is the second feature of legal systems, the persistence of laws long after their maker and those who rendered him habitual obedience have perished. That is, that the laws persist, they stick around, they continue to exist, even after the person who made the law dies, and all of the other people who habitually obeyed that person, making that person sovereign according to Austin's definition, even after all those people are dead, that law just keeps being law. Hart illustrates the point that he's trying to make. We're going to go through each of these features of law. Hart illustrates this overall point with the example of rex. Rex is just the Latin word for king, right? So we imagine a legal system, and it's supposed to be a real bona fide legal system with a king who gets to make the laws, and that king's name is Rex. And Rex makes all of these laws, and at one point, one day, Rex dies. And Rex is immediately replaced, instantly replaced, in fact, by Rex II. Rex's son gets to be king. Instantly, he succeeds to the throne the moment that Rex I's heart stops beating. And here's the thing. Here are the two features, right? One is that Rex II gets legal authority instantly or instantaneously. The legal authority transfers instantly, such that there's a continuous, uninterrupted case where the ruler maintains authority. It's just a different person occupying that role or occupying that office. That's the first feature. And the second feature is persistence. That is, it's the fact that Rex I makes some law, right? Rex I, let's say, outlaws chewing gum. That continues to be law by default. Even if Rex II shows up and is sort of like the lazy inherited son, he doesn't even know about this other law. He doesn't bother with it, he doesn't think about it, he doesn't reaffirm it or anything like that, but it continues to be law into Rex II's term and beyond, let's say, right? That's the feature of persistence. Okay, so there's a lot more to be said here, but the first thing to notice is that continuity and persistence, they apply to different sorts of things. What is continuous? What are the things that have continuity, according to Hart? Well, the thing that has continuity is legal authority or law-making authority, legislative authority. What is continuous is the law-making power that whoever the king is has, right? There's no interruption. And what's persistent, what continues to persist, is not legislative authority, but specific laws. Laws, like a regular, ordinary first-order law outlawing gum chewing, right? That's the sort of thing that persists. Why doesn't Austin have the ability, according to Hart, to explain the continuity of legislative authority? Here's the thing. Habits are historical phenomena. It takes time to establish them. Here, habit just means pattern of behavior. And so you only have a habit of obeying a person if you've been obeying that person in the past, right? So think about the Rex example. Say that Rex I has a habit of being obeyed, or people have a habit, rather, of obeying Rex I. Everybody in the kingdom obeys Rex I. Then Rex I dies. And up until this point, no one was obeying Rex II. Rex II was just the spoiled, annoying son of the king, right? Some of them tried to stay out of his way, but they weren't regularly obeying him, let's assume, right? At the moment when Rex I dies and Rex II ascends to the throne, there isn't yet a habit of obeying Rex II. That takes some time to develop, even if at that very instant that Rex I dies and Rex II becomes king, even if at that very instant people start obeying Rex II, they still don't yet have a habit of obeying Rex II. They have to start obeying Rex II, and then it takes some amount of time. How much? It's unclear. It's an imprecise matter, but it takes some amount of time for all of that obedience to build up and count as a habit. If sovereignty relied on there being a habit of obedience, right, well then sovereignty would be interrupted. It wouldn't be continuous. Because there's a point in time after Rex I is dead when Rex II hasn't yet established that habit, or others haven't established that habit towards Rex II. And so Rex II doesn't yet have sovereignty, according to Austin's theory. But, Hart points out, Rex II in real legal systems does get sovereignty or does get legislative authority. Rex II can start making laws right away. And so Austin's theory can't handle continuity. It can't explain the fact that legal authority or legislative authority continues from one legislator to another uninterrupted. Here's a little bit of what Hart says. This is a good passage where Hart makes very clearly the point that I was just summarizing. He says, Rex II will have the right to make law on his father's death, and when his first orders are issued, they are already law, before any relationship of habitual obedience between him personally and his subjects has had time to establish itself. The first orders that he issues, once he becomes king, already count as law. They don't have to wait until there's a pattern of habitual obedience before gaining legal validity or legal status. Two things to notice about this passage. One is I actually think Hart is misusing the word or the concept of a right here. Hart doesn't very carefully, or in my opinion, not carefully enough, he doesn't distinguish carefully enough between authority, an authority or the authority to do something within a legal system, and a right. This is sort of a side note, but on my view, on my way of understanding it, and I think this is the right way to understand it, this is the way that's in line with the way that we ordinarily talk about these things, and even the way that we talked about these things back in England in 1961 when Hart published this book. A right goes along with a duty. Every time there's a duty, there's a corresponding right. If you have a duty to, not interfere with my free speech, then I have the corresponding right to free speech, so on and so forth. For every right, there's a duty. For every duty, there's a right. The authority to do something means that you have the normative power within a system of rules to create duties and to create rights. They're not themselves rights. They're a kind of ability. Authority or power is the kind of ability, normative ability within a system to create these things and to create corresponding duties. Anyway, so I think that Hart should have said that Rex 2 will have the authority to make law, or the normative power to make law. Anyway, the other important thing to pick up on is the word personally. So, habits, as Austin understands them, and as Hart is sort of forcing Austin to understand them, habits are patterns that involve individual persons, not offices, right? So think about it like this: if you're enrolled in the course to which this recording is part of the content, right? Then you and I have a professional relationship. We don't have a personal relationship. We're not buddies, right? Although we may become buddies, but don't try to find me on the internet or whatever. We have a professional relationship. What that means is that I can sort of be replaced by someone else. If I go into the dean's office, right, and say, I can't take it anymore, I quit, in the middle of the semester, well, then the dean is going to have to go find someone else to fill my role, to step into my office, as instructor of record for this course. And that person is going to then occupy, it seems like, the same relationship or the position in that same relationship that I used to occupy. Like if I made a commitment to you as instructor of this course, and I said, these grades that you've earned, they're going to count for X percentage of your final grade, right? If a new person steps in, that new person may have the authority to change certain things, but they can't just say, none of that stuff counts. None of those previous grades count. Because me right now and that future person who might replace me in this scenario, we're occupying the same role. And so there's just one relationship, right? It's the same thing that if your boss gets fired and gets replaced by someone else, you still have that subordinate boss relationship, right? It's the same relationship, it's just there's another person occupying that office. Well, habits, they just involve people, right? A personal relationship is different, right? So different from the relationship that you and I have when I'm the instructor of this course and you're the student. If you have a personal relationship with your friends and you go out with your friends and you buy food and drinks and you have a great time, and then one of your friends moves away and you find some new friend and you invite them to go do the same activities, you can't say to your new friend, oh, by the way, my old friend promised to pay for the food and drinks this time, so now you have to pay. No, you can't say that because they're not just occupying a role, right, within a system of rules like I am occupying a role of instructor of record for this course, right? So that's a personal relationship. Hart is saying that because Austin explanatory resources are not rich enough to handle the notion of authority and the notion of a role and really the notion of a rule, a system of rules governing people. Because Austin can't explain that, Austin's theory is never going to be able to explain the continuity of law. Here's what Hart says. How does a habit differ from a rule? What is the difference between saying of a group that they have the habit, for example, of going to the cinema on Saturday nights, and, on the other hand, saying that it is the rule with them that the male head is to be bared on entering a church? Okay, what's going on here? What's going on is that Hart is drawing a distinction between habits or mere patterns of behavior on the one hand and rules on the other hand. Habits are just ways that things happen, right? Things that are typical or common or popular, like going to the movies on a certain night. That's typical or common. There's a regular pattern of behavior that a lot of people engage in. But from a regular pattern like that, from that alone, you never get a fact about which types of behavior are correct or incorrect. What you never get are rules. The example that Hart gives is there's a rule that says when men enter a church, they have to take their hat off. They have to bare their head, right? Think about the difference. If you deviate from the first pattern, if you don't go to the movies on Saturday night, you're doing something atypical, but you're not necessarily doing something incorrect or that violates some rule. Whereas if you go into a church in this given society or whatever, if you go into a church and don't remove your hat and you're a male, right, then you've done something improper or incorrect or impermissible. You've violated or broken a rule. This is a huge difference, right? Here's another habit. Here's another pattern of behavior. This is a favorite example of mine. No one walked on the moon, right? Up until this very day, and certainly very regularly up until July 1969, no one walked on the moon. It was a very regular pattern. Every day you woke up, no matter when it was and no matter where you were, and you looked around, there was no one walking on the moon. But then, in July of 1969, a couple guys deviated from that pattern. They did something atypical or unusual, not at all habitual, right? They walked on the moon. When they broke from that pattern, did they do anything incorrect or impermissible, right? Anything not to be done? No, they didn't break any rule, right? Habits are not enough to explain rules. And the thought is, all that Austin has to explain legal systems are habits. But if you're ever going to explain continuity, you need to appeal to things like, well, authority, or for that matter, rights and duties. You need to appeal to official offices, like the office of the president, or of the king, or the legislator. And if you're ever going to appeal to all this stuff, you need rules. The only way to explain offices is with rules. I wonder where Hart says it. Oh, it's in the next section. He's going to mention something about umpires. Maybe we'll discuss the quote in a minute. In cricket or in baseball, there's a person who occupies a certain office, the role or the office of the umpire. And the umpire, of course, can be replaced by a new umpire, and the previous umpire's rulings still count. It's only possible for there to be umpires if there are rules. All the rules of the system are needed, and those rules do many things, but one of the things those rules do is they give a certain person under certain conditions the authority to decide whether a pitch was a ball or a strike, for example. You're never going to explain the existence of an umpire, and therefore you're never going to explain the continuity of umpire authority, right, with mere patterns of behavior. Because of course, you could have people, maybe as a kind of art project or maybe as a random confluence of events, you could have a group of people who just walk around in a field and move in all the ways that the players do and that the umpires do. And they say all the things that the players do. They make all the same sounds, maybe just by chance, right? They make even all the same sounds that the umpire makes. They move and they say, "You're out," or whatever, or "That's a strike." I don't even know what the gesture is for a strike. Anyway, you could have people who behave in all the same ways, but not be playing baseball. They wouldn't be playing baseball if there weren't rules that existed among them. You need the rules in order to get the authority in the offices and the rights and the duties. And you need all of that, which Austin can't explain, in order to explain continuity. You're also going to need all of that in order to explain persistence. So let's talk about persistence now. This passage, this portion of a sentence, actually, appears in the part of the chapter that's about persistence. And this is about persistence. And this is about how Hart is going to claim that Austin can't explain persistence with the mere appeal to habits of obedience. Anyway, this is a very tricky passage. And so when I've taught this course in the past several times, students, often the brave students, the good students, raise their hand and say, "Hey, there was this sentence and I didn't understand it at all and I read it 8 times. Can you explain it now?" This is that sentence. Let's read it slowly. The answer to this problem of why law still. Okay, so what's going on so far? Let's stop. Why law still? He's talking about persistence. The fact that the laws are still there. They persist. They stick around. Why are these laws still laws, right? The problem is a problem for whom? It's a problem for Austin. Austin's habit-based theory of law, right? The thought is, the answer to this problem, or really the explanation of why it's a problem for Austin and why Austin's theory is just kaput. The way to explain persistence, that's what this really means. The way to explain the persistence of laws is in principle the same as the answer, or the way to explain it, to our first problem of why law already. What's why law already? Well, why law already is the question of continuity, though it's actually very confusing for Hart to put it this way because it's not laws that are continuous. Persistence is a property of laws. Continuity is not. It's authority that's continuous, but nonetheless, when Rex 2 has that continuous legislative authority that he got from his dad, right? He issues some order right away, immediately after his father's death. It's law already. It gets to be law right away, right? So that's continuity. That's the fact of continuity. What Hart is saying so far is that the way to explain persistence is the same way we explained continuity. We explain these two things in fundamentally the same way. And then he explains how he explains them. And the answer, the explanation, it involves the substitution of the too simple notion of habits of obedience to a sovereign person. That is, we're going to substitute one thing for another. We're going to take our theory of law and we're going to pluck out of it the idea of habits of obedience to a sovereign. We're going to rip that out of the theory of law and we're going to substitute in something more explanatorily powerful. We're going to substitute in the notion of currently accepted fundamental rules, specifying a class or line of persons whose word is to constitute a standard of behavior for the society. That's the idea. We'll explain what that is in a sec. That's the idea that Austin's habit-based theory needs to be replaced with if we're ever going to explain continuity and persistence. Notice what's going on is Hart is dropping the idea of habits or patterns of behavior, just like he did with continuity in the last section, and he's replacing it with the notion of a rule, in this case a fundamental rule, or rules that do a certain kind of thing, right? So habits are being tossed, and a richer explanatory resource is being substituted, because only with that more powerful source of explanation can we explain these legal phenomena. What kind of rule is he talking about? Well, it's a certain type of rule that he relies on much more later and that he formally introduces later in the book, but he sort of sneaks it in here. Let me explain what it is. When Rex outlaws gum chewing, that's like a first order rule. That's a rule that applies to what people do. It's about people's behavior, whether they may or may not chew gum. But there's another law, or there's another rule, and it's a rule about rules. Like, for example, there's a rule that gives Rex 1 and then subsequently Rex 2. There's a rule that gives them the authority to make rules. That's a rule too. That rule, well, that's more fundamental. It's at the foundation of a legal system. It says that these people get to make the rules. Hart's talking about that kind of rule, the rule about rules. Fundamental rules that specify a class or line of persons whose word is to constitute a standard of behavior. So here, this is confusing. Hart can be confusing. Standard of behavior just means rule. Hart is saying that there are fundamental rules that say whose utterances, whose word, count as rules, right? So what he's talking about here is we need to take the notion of habits and toss it out and replace it with the idea of a rule or rules saying who gets to make rules. A rule about rules, or a bunch of rules about another bunch of rules. That's the idea that you need to appeal to, an idea that Austin doesn't have available to him if you're going to explain the persistence of laws. Okay, so that's what Hart said here. But what is the persistence of laws, and how does a rule about rules explain it? Here's what Hart says toward the very end of the sections of this chapter that we read for this course, where he explains what the problem of persistence is and why the way to explain persistence is to toss out the notion of habits and rely instead on the notion of rules, specifically on higher order rules, rules saying who gets to make rules. Here's what Hart says. When the individual ruler dies, his legislative work lives on. That's persistence. Now we've stated the problem. That is, it's not continuity. It's not the fact that Rex takes over legislative authority instantaneously when Rex 1 dies. That's continuity. Persistence is the fact that Rex makes this law outlawing gum chewing, and it sticks around. That law sticks around long after Rex dies, and all of the citizens who were alive during Rex's reign are dead, but that law just sticks around. It doesn't need to be renewed or anything like that, right? It sticks around until either the whole legal system crumbles or it gets revoked or something like that. It persists. When the individual ruler dies, his legislative work lives on. That's the fact of persistence. Why does it live on? What makes it the case that laws persist? What explains that fact? Well, 4, it rests upon the foundation of a general rule which successive generations of the society continue to respect regarding each legislator whenever he lived. There's a general rule, a fundamental or foundational rule, a rule that says who gets to make the rules. And that rule, the rule about who gets to make the rules, that's a general rule. And that is the same rule. It keeps being accepted by the people. It keeps being, rather, he says, respected, right? So there's one rule out there, and it was the one that gave Rex 1 the power to make laws. And then when Rex 1 died, that same rule kicked in, as it were, and started applying to Rex 2, saying that Rex 2 gets to make the laws. Because that one general rule sticks around, that rule hasn't gone away, right? It's still respected by the people. The people are the ones who are indirectly maintaining this law that was made by Rex 1 even after Rex 1 dies, right? The people do it by respecting this more general rule about who gets to make all the specific rules. Here's what he says. Given the present acceptance of the underlying rule, so now he's talking about that same rule, and now he calls it underlying instead of general. And now instead of respect, he says accept or to accept the rule. So, by the way, Hart's got in mind some mental state, some attitude, which Austin's behaviorist theory cannot appeal to. And he sometimes calls it respect, and he sometimes calls it acceptance, and he also sometimes calls it the internal point of view or the internal aspect of rules. Anyway, it's some way of thinking that all the people have. They accept the underlying rule. That's the rule about how to make rules. They accept the underlying rule, given that they continue and at the present they accept it. The persistence of laws is therefore no more mysterious than the fact that the decision of the umpire in the first round should have the same relevance to the final result, that is the final score of the game, as those, that is the decisions, of the umpire who took his place in the third round. What explains continuity? Here he's talking about continuity, right? Continuity of, the umpire's decisions, decision-making discretion or authority, right? That is continuous. That is, you can it carries on, it's uninterrupted when one umpire gets swapped out for another. The other umpire doesn't have to slowly start calling balls and strikes until people have developed the habit of obeying him or whatever. No. The new umpire takes over right away. That's continuity. And both the decisions of both umpires, the one from the first round and the new one that took over in the third round, the decisions of both the umpires count towards the final score. They count equally or the same or whatever, right? What explains that fact, right, is that there are these underlying rules saying who gets to be an umpire, whose decision counts. It's the umpire. It's not someone in the stands, right? That underlying rule, the underlying rule about who gets to be the umpire, who gets to make those decisions, that explains why two different umpires' scores count in the ways that they do. And there's nothing mysterious about this fact about umpires. And Hart wants to say, so too. There's nothing mysterious about the persistence of laws, right? The fact that Rex's law continues. What explains it ultimately is some higher order rule that says who gets to make the laws. And Hart's theory can explain that. Well, Hart's theory, once we get it in the next two chapters, chapters 5 and 6, is going to explain the notion of rules. It's going to explain it by appeal to an attitude called acceptance. Austin's theory can't explain that because Austin doesn't appeal to attitudes. Austin's theory is behaviorist. That's it.